Well, howdy, and welcome to another edition of Ralph and Robert's Reading Railroad.
Tonight, the Hardy Boys in part 6 of The Tower Treasure. Chapter 11 Anxious Waiting. The suspect, the Hardys learned, was out of prison on parole. His name was John Jackley, but he was known as Red Jackley because when caught before going to prison, he had been wearing a red wig. He lives right here in New York, and maybe he's back home by this time, Joe spoke up. Let's go see him. Just a minute, Mr. Hardy said, holding up his hand. I don't like to leave Mother alone so long. Besides, in this type of sleuthing, 3 detectives together are too noticeable to a crook. This Jackley may or may not be our man, but if he is, he's probably dangerous. I want you boys to take the evening plane home. I'll phone the house the minute the thief is in custody. All right, Dad, his sons chorused, though secretly disappointed that they had to leave. When they reached home, Frank and Joe learned their mother had been working on the case from a completely different angle. Hers was the humanitarian side. I went to call on the Robinsons to try to bolster their spirits, she said. I told them about your trip to New York, and that seemed to cheer them a lot. Monday, I'm going to bake a ham and a cake for you to take to them. Mrs. Robinson isn't well and can do little in the kitchen. That's swell of you, Frank said admiringly. I'll go. Joe told them he had a tennis match to play. I'll do the next errand, he promised. Monday, during a change of class, Frank met Callie Shaw in the corridor. Hi, she said. What great problem is on Detective Hardy's mind? You look as if you just lost your best criminal. Frank grimaced. Maybe I have, he said. He told Callie that he had phoned home at noon, and confidentially expecting to hear that his father had reported the arrest of the real thief of the Applegate money and the exoneration of Mr. Robinson. But there was no word, Callie, and I'm worried. Dad may be in danger. I don't blame you, she said. What do you think has happened? Well, you can never tell when you're dealing with criminals. Now, Frank, you're not trying to tell Father wouldn't let himself get trapped, Callie said. No, I don't think he would, Callie. Maybe Dad hasn't returned because he still hasn't found the man he was looking for. Well, I certainly hope the thief is caught, said Callie. But Frank, nobody really believes Mr. Robinson did it. Nobody but Herd Applegate and the men who employ people. Till they find the man who did take the stuff, Mr. Robinson is out of a job. I'm going over to see the Robinsons soon. Where are they living? Frank gave Callie the address. Her eyes widened. Why, that is one of the poorest sections of the city. Frank, I had no idea the Robinsons' plight was that bad. It is, and it'll be a lot worse unless Mr. Robinson gets work pretty soon. Slim's earnings aren't enough to take care of the whole family. Say, Callie, how about going over to the Robinsons with me after school? Mother's sending a ham and a cake. I'd love to, Callie agreed. The two parted at the door of the algebra teacher's classroom. As soon as the last bell rung, Frank and Callie left the building together. First, they stopped at the Shaw home to leave the girls' books. I think I'll take some fruit to the Robinsons, Callie said. Quickly filled a bag with oranges, bananas, and grapes. When the couple reached the Hardy home, Frank asked his mother if any messages had come. No, not yet, she answered. Frank said nothing to her about being concerned, turned over his father as he tucked the ham under one arm and picked up the cake box. But after he and Callie reached the street, he again confided his concern to Callie. "It does seem strange you haven't heard anything," she admitted. "But don't forget the old saying, no news is good news, so don't worry." "I'll take your advice," Frank agreed. "No use wearing a sour look around the Robinsons." "Or when you're with me either," Callie said, tossing her head teasingly. Frank hailed an approaching bus bound for the section of the city in which the Robinsons lived. He and Callie climbed aboard. It was a long ride, and the streets became less and less attractive as they neared the outskirts of Bayport. "It's a shame that's what it is," declared Callie abruptly. "The Robinsons were always accustomed to having everything so nice. Now they have to live here. Oh, I hope your father catches the man who committed that robbery, and soon." Her eyes flashed, and for a moment she looked so fierce that Frank laughed. "I suppose you'd like to be the judge and jury at his trial, eh?" "I'd give him 100 years in jail," Callie declared. When they came to the street where the Robinsons had moved, they found it was an even poorer thoroughfare than they had expected. There were small houses badly in need of paint and repairs. Shabbily dressed children were playing in the roadway. At the far end of the street stood a small cottage that somehow contrived to look somewhat like a home in spite of the surroundings. The picket fence had been repaired and the yard had been cleaned up. "This is where they live," said Frank. Callie smiled. "It's the neatest place on the whole street." Polly and Tessie answered their knock. The twins' faces lighted up with pleasure when they saw who the callers were. "Frank and Callie," they said. "Come on in," they exclaimed. The callers were greeted with kind dignity by Mrs. Robinson. She looked pale and thin, but had the same self-possession she always shown at Tower Mansion. "We can't stay long," Callie explained. "But Frank and I just thought we'd run out here to see how y'all are. We brought something for you." Fruit, ham, and cake were presented. As the twins oohed and awed over the food, Mrs. Robinson's eyes filled with tears. "You are dear people," she said. "Frank, tell your mother I can't thank her enough." Frank grinned as Mrs. Robinson went on. "Callie, we shall enjoy this fruit very much. Many thanks." Paula said, "It's a wonderful gift. Say, did you know Perry got a better job the second day he was at the supermarket?" "No, that's swell," Frank replied. "It didn't take the manager long to find out how smart Slim is, eh?" The twins giggled, but Mrs. Robinson said dolefully, "I wish my husband could find a job. Since no one around here will employ him, he's thinking of going to another city to get work." "And leave you here?" "I suppose so. We don't know what to do." "It's so unfair," Paula flared up. "My father didn't have a thing to do with that miserable robbery, and yet he has to suffer for it just the same." Miss Robinson said to Frank hesitantly, "Has Mr. Hardy discovered anything yet?" "I don't know," Frank admitted. "We haven't heard from him. He's been in New York following up some clues, but so far there's been no word. We hardly dare hope that he'll be able to clear Mr. Robinson," the woman said sorrowfully. "The whole case is so mysterious." "I've stopped thinking of it," Tessie declared. "If the mystery is cleared up, okay. If it isn't, we won't starve at any rate, and my father knows we believe in him." "Yes, I suppose it doesn't do much good to keep talking about it," agreed Mrs. Robinson. "We've gone over the whole matter so thoroughly that there's nothing more to say." And so by consent, the subject was changed. For the rest of their stay, Frank and Callie chatted of doings at school. Mrs. Robinson and the girls invited them to for supper. but Callie insisted that she must go. As they were leaving, Mrs. Robinson drew Frank to one side. "Promise me one thing," she said. "Let me know as soon as your father returns. That is, if he has any news." "I'll do that, Mrs. Robinson," Frank agreed. "I know what this suspense must be like for you and the twins." "It's terrible, but as long as Fenton Hardy and his sons are working on the case, I'm sure it'll be straightened out." Callie and Frank were unusually silent all the way home. They had been profoundly affected by the change that the Tower Mansion mystery had caused in the lives of the Robinsons. Callie lived but a few blocks from the Hardy home. Frank accompanied her to the door. "See you tomorrow," he said. "Yes, Frank, and I hope you'll hear good news from your father." The boy quickened his steps and ran eagerly into the Hardy house. Joe met him. "Any phone call?" Joe shook his head. "Mother's pretty worried that something has happened to Dad." Chapter 12. A Disturbing Absence. Another whole day went by. When still no word had come from Mr. Hardy, his wife phoned the New York hotel. She was told that the detective had checked out the day before. Discouraged and nervous about the new mystery of their father's disappearance, Frank and Joe found it almost impossible to concentrate on their studies. Then, the following morning, when Mrs. Hardy came to awaken them, she wore a broad smile. "Your father is home," she said excitedly. "He's all right, but he's had a bad time. He's asleep now and will tell you everything after school." The boys were wild with impatience to learn the outcome of his trip, but they were obliged to curb their curiosity. "Dad must be mighty tired," Joe remarked as Mrs. Hardy went downstairs to start breakfast. "I wonder where he came from." "Probably he was up all night. When he's working on a case, he forgets about sleep. Do you think he found out anything?" "Hope so, Frank. I wish he'd wake up and tell us. I'd hate to go back to school without knowing." But Mr. Hardy had not awakened by the time the boys set out for school, although they lingered until they were in danger of being late. As soon as classes were over, they shattered all records in their race home. Fenton Hardy was in the living room. As they rushed in panting, he grinned broadly. He looked refreshed after his long sleep, and it was evident that his trip had not been entirely without success, for his manner was cheerful. "Hello, boys. Sorry I worried you and Mother." "What luck, Dad?" asked Frank. "Good and bad. Here's the story. I went to the house where Red Jackley was boarding. Although he seemed to be an exemplary parolee, I decided to watch him a while and try to make friends." "And how could you do that?" "By taking a room in the same house and pretending to be a fellow criminal." "Wow!" Joe cried. And then Jackley himself spoiled everything. He got mixed up in a jewel robbery and cleared out of the city. Luckily, I heard him packing, and I trailed him. The police were watching for him, and he couldn't get out of town by plane or bus. He outwitted the police by jumping a freight on the railroad. "And you still followed?" "I lost him 2 or 3 times, but fortunately I managed to pick up his trail again. He got out of the city and into upper New York State. Then his luck failed him. A railroad detective recognized Jackley, and the chase was on. Up to that time, I had been content with just keeping behind him. I had still hoped to pose as a fellow fugitive and win his confidence, but when the pursuit started in earnest, I had to join the officers." "And they caught Jackley?" "Not without great difficulty. Jackley, by the way, was once a railroad man. Strangely enough, he worked not many miles from here. He managed to steal a railroad handcar and got away from us. But he didn't last long, for the handcar jumped the tracks on a curve, and Jack Lee was badly smashed up. Killed? Frank asked quickly. No, but he's in a hospital right now, and the doctors say he hasn't much of a chance. He's under arrest. Oh, yes. He's being held for the jewel thieves and also for the theft from the actor's dressing room, but he probably won't live to answer either charge. Didn't you find out anything that would connect him with the tower robbery? Not a thing. The boys were disappointed, and their expression showed it. Fred Jackley died without confessing. The secret of the tower robbery would die with him. Mr. Robinson might never be cleared. He might be doomed to spend the rest of his life under a cloud, suspected of being a thief. Have you talked to Jackley? Frank asked. I didn't have a chance. He wasn't conscious. Then you may never be able to get a confession from him. Mr. Fenton Hardy shrugged. I may be able to. If Jackley regains consciousness and knows he's going to die, he may admit everything. I intend to see him in the hospital and ask him about the tower robbery. Is he far away? Albany. I explained my mission to the doctor in charge, and he promised to telephone as soon as it was possible for Jackley to see anyone. You say he used to work near here? Joe asked. He was once employed by the railroad. Oh, then he knows all the country around here well. Then he became mixed up in some thefts from freight cars, and after he got out of jail, turned professional criminal. I suppose he came back here because he is so familiar with this area. I promised to call Mrs. Robinson, Frank spoke up. Is it okay to tell her about Jackley? Yes, it may cheer her up, but ask her not to tell anyone. Frank dialed the number and relayed part of his father's story. The accused man's wife was overwhelmed and relieved by the news, but promised not to divulge the information. Just as Frank finished the call, the doorbell rang. Frank ushered in the private detective, Oscar Smuff. Your pa home? He asked. Yes, come in. Frank led the way into the living room. Smuff, although he considered himself a top-notch sleuth, stood in awe of Fenton Hardy. He cleared his throat nervously. Good afternoon, Oscar, Mr. Hardy said pleasantly. Won't you sit down? Detective Smuff eased himself into an armchair, then glanced inquiringly at the two boys. At once, Mr. Hardy said, unless your business is very private, I'd like to have my son stay. Well, I reckon that'll be all right, Smuff conceded. I hear you're working this Applegate case. Perhaps I am. You've been out of town for several days, Smuff remarked cannily, so I deduce you must be working on it. Very clever of you, Detective Smuff, Mr. Hardy said, smiling at the visitor. Smuff squirmed uneasily in his chair. I'm working on this case, too. I'd like to get that $1,000 reward, and I'd share it with you. Just wondering if you found any clues. Mr. Hardy's smile faded. He said with annoyance, if I went away, it is my own business. And if I'm working on the tower robbery, that is also my business. You'll have to find your own clues, Oscar. Well, now, don't get on your high horse, Mr. Hardy, the visitor visitor said. I'm just anxious to get this whole affair cleared up, and I thought we might work together. I heard you were with the officers what chased this here notorious criminal Red Jackley. Mr. Hardy gave a perpetual start. He had no idea the news of the capture of Jackley had reached Bayport, much less his own participation in the chase had become known. The local police must have received the information, and somehow Smuff had heard the news. What of it? Mr. Hardy asked in a casual way. Did Jackley have anything to do with the tower case? How should I know? Wasn't it that what you were working on? As I've told you, that's my affair. Detective Smuff looked sad. I guess you just don't want to cooperate with me, Mr. Hardy. I was thinking of going over to the hospital where this man Jack Lee is and questioning him about the case. Mr. Hardy's lips narrowed into a straight line. You can't do that, Oscar. He isn't conscious. The doctor won't let you see him. I'm going to try. Jack Lee'll come to sometime, and I want to be on hand. There's a 6 o'clock plane, and I aim to leave my house at 5:30 and catch it. He thumped his chest in admiration. Detectives don't have to show up for a plane till the last minute, eh, Mr. Hardy? Well, I'll just have a talk with Jack Lee tonight, and I may let you know what he says. Have it your own way, said Mr. Hardy. But if you take my advice, you'll not visit the hospital. You'll just spoil everything. Jack Lee will talk when the time comes. So there's something in it, Smuff said triumphantly. Well, I'm going over there and get a confession. That he arose, stumped out of the room, and left the house.
No part of this episode may be reproduced without my personal permission. Railfan Roberts Reading Railroad is a production of Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions, and all podcast episodes are owned by Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions.